Hello, and welcome to the Learning from Practice podcast from the Center for Peacemaking Practice at George Mason University's School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. This podcast is created for the purpose of sharing stories of peacemaking practice and practitioners from around the world. I'm Susan Allen Nan, the Director of the Center for Peacemaking Practice, and I thank you for listening.
So I asked people at the beginning, why are you here? Because it took a lot of courage for people to get themselves there. And one woman stood up, I don't know if she was Israeli or Palestinian, and it really doesn't matter. And she stood up and she said, I'm here because I know there has to be a better way. And I did a rapid assessment of her approximate age and what I know to be the history of the region, and realized that from her experience she couldn't possibly know anything about a better way.
That's the voice of Louise Diamond. She's speaking to me as we walk by Lake Champlain near her home in Burlington, Vermont.
In her heart, she knows all about peace, even though in her life experience she knows nothing. She's never experienced it. And I believe that each of us has that inner knowing, because if we didn't, we wouldn't have all the capital letter words that we have, like love and justice and beauty and mercy and peace and freedom. And these are our spiritual, these are the components of our spiritual genetic code.
Louise's own journey to peacemaking began with a struggle against cancer in her very early years.
And was in the 0% category to survive for 5 years. 1973, and then 9 months later, in 1974, a whole new cancer, not a metastasis. And that woke me up. I was in my 20s.
Wow.
Yeah, that woke me up. And it woke me up spiritually as well. And so I had several years of deep spiritual renewal, which mostly took place in the natural world. I went to the natural world to learn how to live fully. Since we're all going to die, really the question is, how do you want to be when you die? Which really is a question of how do you want to live?
For Louise, how she wanted to live was through being a conscious part of the web of connections that make up our world.
Everything is connected in the web of life, and that includes me. That I am a part of all.
She described realizing that if she wanted to be a part of that all, she had to serve the all in turn. But how? Like many of us, she began with the experience she had.
And I had already been a psychotherapist and an organizational consultant. So my field was human behavior, human relations, especially groups, intergroup relations. I'd already worked with individuals, with couples, with families, with children, with adults, with seniors, or elders as I like to call them, with organizations of many sizes. And I found myself in Washington, D.C., so I realized it was time to take what I knew about human relations and intergroup relations to the international arena. This was in the mid-'80s.
So she joined a field that, at that time, was just emerging, that of conflict resolution, and describes a heart resonance with this work. But knowing that she would be working in war zones, she first decided to tackle her own aversion to violence. Not wanting to be judgmental of those she would work with, Louise sought to understand violence.
I read memoirs from soldiers. I watched videos, war movies. At first it was very hard. I played video games, shoot 'em up, It was very hard at first. And gradually I got so I could tolerate it. Then I got so it was okay. Then I got so I didn't have to close my eyes at the bad parts of the movies. Then I got so I could look. Then I got so I was interested. Then I got so I was really interested. And I got to the place where I realized this is what bloodlust could feel like. This is what the thrill of the kill is. And once I knew that I could experience that without ever having been in situations that brought that out of me, that I could go anywhere in the world, because I could have deep compassion for anyone, even the worst perpetrators, because I knew, given whatever circumstances in life, who knows where any of us could have behaved.
Later, we moved inside for a warmer and less windy discussion, and Louise began to tell me some of the stories of her experiences in international peacemaking.
So I spoke earlier of the essence being that inner spark, that inner spirit of peace, that seed of peace that we all carry, and seeing my role as being a nurturer or an activator of that seed. So, but then it's not up to me, then it's up to the people to grow that seed and put it to use. So I'll tell a story about Bosnia. I was invited by OSCE, came to IMTD right shortly after the Dayton Accords were implemented. And they had been, the OSCE was in charge of getting elections going in Bosnia. And they were working with international organizations and aid groups who had been busy building houses and schools and hospitals, rebuilding, I should say. And on the theory that if you rebuild them, the people who left will come back. But the people who left weren't coming back. And they couldn't figure out why. Well, look, we built you this beautiful new house. Why aren't you moving in? Well, duh, because the people who ethnically cleansed my family are still living next door. So they figured there's a piece missing, and we'd better find some people who know about that. So they came to us, and they said, can you come and do some, what can you do? Can you do some dialogue? So we said yes. So I went to Bosnia, and we started doing some dialogue among the three ethnic groups. And we say there's three, the Croats, the Bosniaks, and the Serbs, but really there was so much intermarriage before the war that so many people were a little of this, a little of that. But anyway, there were three main groups. And they were quite separated during the war because even people who were in mixed marriages had to choose. It was a very difficult thing for people, especially the young men who, their mother was Muslim, they call themselves Bosniaks, and the father was Serb. Whose army did they join or get conscripted into? And then they were fighting somebody in their own family. It was very difficult, very painful for people. So there was one memory that I carry from one of those dialogues. Well, actually two I'll tell you about. One, we had in the room, there was a Bosniak woman, middle-aged woman, maybe in her 50s, 40s, 50s, I'm going to say 50s, who had a son who had died in the war as a soldier. And also in the room was a young man who had been a Serb soldier. And so she immediately identified him as the enemy and didn't want anything to do with him, and he was, he was the enemy. Well, he was very upset by this because he was conscripted. He hadn't wanted to be a soldier. He didn't like fighting. He was a poet. And he would always correct people when they would refer to him as a soldier. He would say ex-soldier. So we were doing some activity. After a while, when people were starting to get to know each other a little bit, we did some activity, and he chose not to participate. And he went off in a corner by himself. And he came back at the end of the exercise, and after people had debriefed on what that had been like for them, he said, well, what I did is I went and wrote a poem, and I'd like to read it to you. So he read this poem, and it spoke about how he had never wanted to be a soldier. He was a peaceful person, loved everybody, hated violence. It was a beautiful poem. It was very heartfelt. It was really his expression of the grief in him of what he had felt forced to do and become. And it touched this woman very much. She was like the prototypical mother who had lost a son, and he was the prototypical soldier who had killed a son, but also somebody's son, right? She was so touched by this poem that they embraced and became very, very close friends. They were inseparable for the rest of the workshop. And when we went back 3 months later and interviewed people in the workshop to say what had stayed with them from our time together, were there particular activities that we had done or things that we had said or things that had happened that they had carried away with them that had made a difference in their lives. And virtually everybody spoke of the image of those two people embracing, that's what they carried away with them. And, I can't say that there was anything I did that made that happen, right? But the fact of our being there together, the fact of creating a safe space for that to happen, the fact of creating ground rules that allowed people to participate or not participate at the level that they chose, the way we set a tone, and the way we invited people into that space allowed that to happen. And that made a difference. And that was the essence of peace coming out, growing inside, and just by giving it the right environment to grow in.
So how does Louise work? What's important to her? She spoke to me about the importance of partnerships.
Throughout all of my career as a peace builder, I invited other people in to work in teams with me. And in some cases this was more fruitful than others. But it was important for me for a variety of reasons. One is I'm a firm believer in diversity and knowing that I can't do it myself, and when we bring different perspectives together, we have a richer set of possibilities. So for the work in Bosnia, I brought in a fellow who had actually taken one of my conflict resolution courses. That's how I had met him. And it was one of the courses where I used the Omania simulation in a week-long training setting. He was a lawyer and a mediator and had always wanted to work internationally, so I invited him to come and work with me in Bosnia. And he was also a master gardener. So we created a metaphor of gardening because we found that in Bosnia after the war, it was very difficult for people, and this is true everywhere I've ever been where I know it was true in Rwanda and elsewhere, when the violence and the devastation is so close in time, it's sometimes hard to talk about it. So we developed a metaphor around gardening that allowed people to speak of their experience from the point of view of being the gardener in the garden. And in one workshop that we did, we actually set up a fake garden in the room. And we had implements and we had seeds and we had, I don't remember, we made cutouts of vegetables or I don't even remember, but we made it physical. And we invited people to speak and to work in the garden with a variety of questions like, what do you need, what's in the garden now? And what do you need to do with what's in the garden now to prepare the ground for what you want to plant for next? And so what's in the garden was debris and, trash and, even unexploded weapons and, the nasty things that had to be removed, and then the ground had to be prepared and turned over, the soil had to be turned over, and then new things had to be planted, and they were doing this in mixed ethnic groups, of course. That was very powerful, and that's something I haven't really written much about. But again, it gets to the essence of things, because we're not asking people to say, tell us your war story, what happened to you in the war and how has it affected you and what do you need, and all of which is useful in its time. But this was a way of inviting people in a safe, ritualistic, metaphoric way to move into another dimension of consciousness, to speak of their experience and to particularly not just speak of it, but to see the transformative journey of it. Here's what we ended up with, here's what we want, here's what we have to do to get rid of what's left over and create what it is we want. It was very powerful for people.
Finally, I asked Louise to share some of the lessons she's learned in her many years of work. And I'm wondering, as you look back on your many stories, your many experiences in conflict transformation, what sticks with you that you want to pass on to future generations of conflict transformation people?
Oh, good question. So I'll say a couple of things. As you know, I bring a systems approach to this work. And for me, I spoke earlier of going into the natural world to learn about life, and the lesson being all about the interconnectedness of life and the oneness. And so that's a spiritual language to describe a spiritual reality, but there is a scientific language to describe that same reality, and that language is the language of general systems theory. And I studied that language in 1974 and realized immediately that it was the scientific vocabulary for the spiritual reality. And so I've been a proponent, a spokesperson for the systems view in all of our conflict resolution work and beyond. I've also been bringing for many years now systems thinking to our consideration of other global issues like climate change and weapons of mass destruction, things like that. So one of the things that we know about systems is that there are interactions among the parts that become nonlinear. In other words, you can't control them. You think you're setting something in motion and you assume that there'll be a linear path of cause and effect, but it ain't necessarily so. And the relationships, the interactions of the parts determine the patterns that develop in the system. So the most beautiful example of this is what happened in Cyprus, in particular in the Turkish Cypriot part of Cyprus. Now it's a smaller system than the Greek Cypriot side, physically smaller, numerically smaller, which made it easier for systemic change. But you can trace a direct line of systemic change from our work. So, as you know, I did a lot of work in Cyprus over many years, trained a lot of people, brought a lot of people together across the two sides. And there was a core of people on both sides who came again and again and became our advanced students, and we trained them as trainers, and they went on to, many of them over the years actually went on to take very prominent positions in society, like chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, or heads of their political parties, or on their president's staff, or on the negotiating team. But in the beginning, they came as private citizens. And there were, I would say, two individuals in particular. A fairly well-connected businessman and a kind of street business kind of guy who didn't really have that many prominent connections. They bonded. I don't know if they had bonded before coming to our activities, but they certainly were bonded during our activities. And after each session, they would go back and have a meeting with the President Denktash, and tell him what had happened and what they learned. And then they would talk to the media and get on television or radio and say what they had learned. And then they would take it to their respective communities, to the business community, to their political parties, and say, here's what we learned, here's what we did, here's what we're still thinking about. So they spread the knowledge throughout their society. And the combination of that, first of all, it demystified it, right? It didn't allow a lot of conspiracy theories to grow up, because here were two well-respected members of the community, and they weren't the only ones, but they were primary in this, saying what was going on, being very transparent, and in the process spreading the knowledge and information. So as the years passed and as more people, as I said, became more prominent in positions of authority, that combination of spreading through the society's matrix and leadership positions made a difference, made a big difference. So that when it came time for a referendum, the Turkish Cypriots unexpectedly voted yes. And thousands of people came out in the streets. And they came out and they actually sidelined the president, who had been a big voice of no, because they saw new possibilities, because that new awareness came from inside the system. Now, we could not have predicted that. We did not select these people to be spokesmen. They took it on themselves. And although I don't know any of the stories, I'm sure they got some pushback from their friends and colleagues, family, neighbors, who knows? I have no idea, but I can't imagine that they didn't. They weren't the only ones active like that, sharing, but they stood out. So I in terms of what I want to pass on to people, it's to pay attention to really listen to the feedback that the system is giving you. Because that's how the system learns, is by paying attention to its own interactions with its environment and the response that comes back. So we noticed that there was nothing we could do or not do to enhance it. It was happening in a nonlinear way on its own. But what we didn't do is look for how we might foster that in the Greek Cypriot community. We didn't sit down with our Greek Cypriot colleagues and friends and say, look what's happening there. How could that be happening here? Not that there weren't individuals who were doing something like that, but it's a much bigger, more complex society. It wasn't happening there. And when it came down to the wire for the referendum, they didn't have that community support. So it's just an interesting little tidbit about the importance of, first of all, understanding that what you set in motion has unexpected consequences, unintended consequences. Some can be very negative, and some can be very positive. But to listen for those, to pay attention to them, and really learn from them. And that's why practice is so important in building theory, because if you're not paying attention to what's happening as a result of your practice, you're not able to refine it. We didn't go into Bosnia with this idea of we have to do garden metaphor. We got to the garden metaphor because we heard, as we met people, that they couldn't talk about what was going on directly. So we had to change the practice. We couldn't go in with a theory and make it happen. We had to adjust the practice, adapt the practice to the realities on the ground. So that's one thing I would like to leave with people.
Before I left, Louise mentioned one final thing: the power of being peace.
The power of being peace, the power of the energy of peace, and how it affects a system. So over and over again, wherever I went in the world, people would consistently say to me, Louise, what you said, what you did was wonderful, it was very helpful for us, but the most important thing was how you are. And I understand that. And there were times, because I have a deep connection to the spirit of peace, and I have a deep connection to the energy of peace, because peace is a vibration. Love is a vibration. Fear is a vibration. Hate is a vibration. All of our emotional states set off certain frequencies. And we are affected by those states in one another because we share a common field of consciousness.
Thank you to Louise Diamond for her work, for her life of conflict transformation, and for allowing us to share it. If you would like to find out more about Louise or her work, please visit our website at scar.gmu.edu/CPP. Thank you for listening.